Evaluating Rodney's uses regarding violence in Grannies with My Brothers. Grannies with My Brothers is a book written by the Guyanese revolutionary Walter Rodney. He saw what was happening during the time shortly after colonial imperialism in places like Jamaica and other parts of the world that had recovered from European influence. The title Groundings of My Brothers refers to the fact that he was teaching this directly to people who otherwise in these countries would maybe perhaps not have had a proper education. And he was giving it directly to the people into their ears. To understand what Rodney discusses in his books regarding violence, we need to first think about his perspective. He grew up in a world surrounded by colonialist and imperialism. There was both the economic imperialism of the fact that the British controlled most of the economy, especially during the colonial period, and actually still had a hold on number one, the exports into the country, the imports into the country, and the exports out of the country as well. Societally, many white people and otherwise mixed race people still lived in these countries. And these regimes still had destructive effects on the countries that were held by Europeans. Racism. Racism existed quite heavily in Jamaica and other parts of the Afro-Caribbean region. It was not only institutional in the fact of that many blacks could not move up the ladder in places like Jamaica and other various places, but it was also the fact that they knew that they were not represented. He evidences this with the various things like not seeing themselves as models or beauty, or in the example of young girls playing with white dolls. And also, the racism could exist in a psychological form. The very fact that they don't think of themselves as black, the very fact that their entire way of living and speaking and existence, their brain form is being changed to a white way of thinking. And we also have to think about his struggle for liberation. He talks a lot about the different kind of classes of people, of which he kind of describes as lackeys of imperialism, or people consider what we call black or white by color of skin. But within his writings, he describes black as basically any group who is dominated by the primary white culture. So the whites are basically those who are in power. They don't always have to be the ones who are white by skin. And he describes this in the very fact of that the white world does, in his writing, he describes it as the white world tells who is black. And we also need to understand that his perspective is quite applicable, and it's not the first perspective of work like this. So we can think of him as almost like a Malcolm X of sorts. And he talks very much about Malcolm X as essentially like almost like an inspiration in his writing. And it's not just something that can go forward to one country. He's trying to explain the transnationality of this entire issue here. Rodney's expectations and goals for his work here are also something that need to be examined. Rodney's struggled and told that people needed black power and liberation. He said that if we're not proud of themselves, they would never free. And he also says that in order to understand and to understand being black, African history and knowledge are extremely important. And he's saying that if the issue is that they need to expand themselves by revolutionary means, or whether that be revolutionary, let's say by force, which is what we might think about, but also like the revolution of like the new way of thinking. And he also advocates for transnational solidarity. He says that white power has been slowly dissolving all across the world. And so that's obviously something that he's saying this is like the opportunity is now. We also, in discussion, have watched the Jamaican film The Harder They Come, which is a pictorial documentation of kind of what was really going on around that time period during that time. So we could almost consider Ivan's journey almost like a sort of odyssey of sorts. So we could consider him like going into this new place, a journey of defiance also. Just the fact that he leaves the rural area is defiant of the very problems that exist. And The example of the mango in the beginning shows that things at times were tough, and that he was not able to have that mango to give to his mother. And we also say that the music of the film is also defiance. So when he was exploited by the music people, he defied against them and attacked them. And it's also evident because the very musical industry was dominated primarily by that one person. And even though there were different producers, even though because he didn't work with Hilton, they would not allow him the ability to work with them. And Ivan is struggles throughout the movie in various forms. And when they say the oppressors are trying to get me down, he's saying that eventually their ways will come back. He's saying like the harder they fall, the harder that they impress, the more they're going to fall when they rise up. And he also says that it's risky, and he's going to keep fighting no matter the fact that he knows that the odds are against him. And he also repeats these words and says, I'm going to keep trying and I'm going to keep defying what's going on. However, there are also some quite concerning things in Rodney's work and referenced quite a bit in his book and seem to be overshadowed by the other things in which he says. But he also uses quite a bit of repeating comparisons to Marxist countries' writings, ideologies that I don't necessarily think meld well, not only with the international audience, but also with things like human rights. So Rodney talks quite a bit about the Chinese of the country and saying that they should align with Chairman Mao. And we can argue the fact that Chairman Mao killed many of his own people, even probably much worse than, let's say, a Stalin, because he killed many of innocent people, not just political prisoners, but also through his actions and improper decisions from the Maoism splint of communist policy. And he also talks about the Russian Revolution and how it put an end to Russian imperialism in the Far East. And that was not a good comparison, perhaps, because it was quite. And he also mentions other heavily communist countries that also committed many human rights violations, such as Vietnam, North Korea, and those are not exactly things that we would really particularly think of as like positive examples to use of like how to run like how to rise up against a country. And there's, especially to an international audience, quite concerning. The conclusions and the considerations on Rodney's work are also something interesting to look at. So it resonated widely and it was incredibly important. His use of knowledge as a tool not only taught people, but it also showed them that they had power over these regimes. And we can also evaluate it and say, like, the fact that that's not about individuality, it's about a group effort, which is also very important because it is talking about groups. And although violence should not allow oppression, such as the British violence and other violences of that sort, we should also use the example of how it should not restart it. For example, the Haitian Revolution and the fact that they rouse up against the French, and yet violence still continues there to oppress multiple people, and the very violence in the country has caused so many problems for all of its people. However, we can also consider that this was very brave and resilient, and we know that the odds were quite fairly stacked against them, and we can understand that this is a cry for help, and perhaps a hope for a better world where racism and structural violence don't reign free and people can live in equitable like equality of sorts where people are represented and see themselves in the greater idea of culture. Thank you.